Bumpy Johnson. Long before the legends, before the whispers and the warnings, he was simply a young man trying to survive in Harlem, a place bursting with culture, hope, and pain at the same time. Harlem was not just a neighborhood, it was a prize. Money moved through illegal lotteries, street deals, and backroom businesses. Outside gangs watched closely, waiting for the right moment to take control. For the people who lived there, every day felt uncertain. A single mistake could cost a home, a future, or a life. Bumpy grew up watching powerful outsiders exploit his community while offering nothing in return. He saw families pushed into silence and young men forced into dangerous choices simply to survive. He learned something early. The streets were not ruled by chaos. They were ruled by organization. That understanding led him to one of the most powerful and feared figures Harlem had ever produced, Stephanie St. Clair. She did not need a loud fighter. She needed a thinking man. Bumpy became her protector, her problem solver, and quietly her most trusted weapon. He studied how money flowed, how loyalty was tested, and how influence could travel farther than violence ever could. While others chased quick respect, Bumpy built something slower and far more dangerous. He built trust, and in an underworld where betrayal was normal, trust was power. By the time the streets finally learned his name, his position was already secured. The legend had not arrived suddenly. It had been carefully constructed, one silent decision at a time. The war that nearly tore Harlem apart began quietly, with fear spreading faster than rumors. At the center of it stood Bumpy Johnson, a man who understood that real battles are rarely announced. For years, the streets of Harlem had protected their own businesses and underground economy, but outside eyes were watching closely. Powerful men saw Harlem not as a community, but as untapped profit. Then one name started to echo through back rooms and street corners: Dutch Schultz. Schultz did not arrive with negotiations, he arrived with pressure. His men moved aggressively, forcing local operators to hand over money, threatening families, and making examples of anyone who refused. Fear became part of daily life. Shop owners lowered their voices. Numbers runners avoided familiar routes. Even longtime street figures began questioning how long they could survive. But Bumpy refused to answer violence with chaos. Instead of rushing into open war, he slowed everything down. He listened. He studied Schultz's moves. He understood that fighting Schultz directly on the streets would only destroy Harlem before it destroyed the enemy. So Bumpy chose a different battlefield. Quiet meetings replaced public confrontations. Messages were delivered through people Schultz respected. Powerful crime figures were carefully approached, not to start a war, but to stop one. Behind closed doors, Bumpy made Harlem impossible to ignore. The pressure began to shift. Schultz was dangerous but unpredictable. Bumpy was steady and reliable. And in the underworld, reliability creates alliances faster than fear. Slowly, the invasion lost momentum. The forced takeovers stalled. The threat softened. What Schultz could not crush with intimidation, Bumpy neutralized with influence. Harlem survived, not because its streets were stronger, but because its protector was smarter. That moment changed everything. From that day forward, Bumpy Johnson was no longer just defending territory. He was reshaping power itself. After the storm with rival gangs had passed, Bumpy Johnson found himself standing in a place no one expected him to reach. He was no longer just a local power, he had become the bridge between two dangerous worlds. Inside the streets of Harlem, his word carried weight. Outside Harlem, powerful figures now treated him as the only door into the neighborhood's underground economy. Deals began to move through him. Territory was discussed through him. Problems were solved through him. But what made Bumpy truly different was not how many men feared him. It was how many people trusted him. In a world built on betrayal, that kind of reputation was priceless. Behind his public image, another story quietly unfolded. Families struggling to survive suddenly found their rent paid. Small business owners stopped receiving threats. Young men who were about to be swallowed by street wars were quietly redirected into safer work. He never made speeches about helping. He simply did it, not to clean his past, but to protect his future. Prison still followed him like a shadow. Years were lost behind walls. Friends disappeared. Power shifted when he was gone. Yet every time he returned, something remained unchanged. The streets still listened. In his later years, his path crossed with a man fighting a completely different kind of war, Malcolm X. One came from crime, the other from resistance, but both understood the same truth. Harlem was not just a place, it was a people. Their connection shocked outsiders, but to the neighborhood it made sense. Power wears many faces. Some protect with words, others protect from the shadows. Bumpy Johnson had chosen his battlefield long ago. Not in front of cameras, not in public marches, but inside the silent systems that decided who survived and who didn't. By the time his story reached its final chapter, Bumpy Johnson, no longer needed to prove who he was. The underworld already knew his life had been filled with illegal business, dangerous alliances, and choices that could never be erased. He paid the price in years behind bars. He buried friends, he watched power shift while he waited on the other side of prison walls, yet something followed him everywhere. Respect, not the kind built from fear alone, the kind built from consistency. In the streets of Harlem, people remembered what it felt like before outside forces tried to turn their community into nothing more than a profit machine. They remembered who stood between them and complete takeover. Bumpy never claimed to be a hero. He never asked for forgiveness. He understood exactly what he was. But he also understood what Harlem needed. In a criminal world designed to silence smaller communities, he forced powerful organizations to listen. He forced negotiations where violence was expected. He forced recognition where erasure was planned. That alone made him dangerous. His strength was never in how loudly he threatened. It was in how calmly he controlled chaos. When his life finally came to an end, he did not leave behind a shining empire. There were no public celebrations, no official honors, only stories. Stories whispered by old neighbors, stories repeated by former rivals, stories remembered by people who survived because the streets stayed quieter than they should have. In the underworld, names disappear quickly, but some refuse to fade, not because they ruled forever, but because for a moment in history they changed how power moved. That is why Bumpy Johnson is still spoken of as a legend, not for the crimes he committed, but for the balance he protected in a world that rarely shows mercy.